this episode, we dive into the worst animal serial killers of all time. From a cougar who got terrorized by a wild grizzly bear to multiple fishermen who became a Bengal tiger's feast. But let's start with our first story. The morning of June 15, 2014 dawned crisp and clear over Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming. Golden sunlight filtered through towering pines, casting long shadows across pristine wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. For seasoned photographer Jake Morrison, 34, this perfect weather meant ideal conditions for his solo backcountry expedition documenting grizzly bear behavior. Jake was known among colleagues for his fearless approach to wildlife photography, his rugged beard and weathered hands telling stories of countless nights spent in wilderness under nothing but stars. What Jake didn't know was that he had chosen to camp directly in the territory of Scarface, a massive 600-pound male grizzly bear whose facial scars from territorial battles made him instantly recognizable to park rangers. This particular bear had become dangerously food-conditioned after years of accessing improperly stored supplies from careless campers, transforming him from a typical wilderness dweller into something far more sinister. Grizzly bears possess one of the most powerful bite forces in the animal kingdom, capable of crushing a bowling ball with their jaws. When a grizzly becomes food-conditioned, it loses its natural fear of humans and begins to associate people with easy meals. A deadly combination that transforms these magnificent creatures into efficient killing machines. Despite his experience, Jake had made a critical error that first night. Exhausted from his long hike, he had stored some food in his tent rather than using bear-proof containers required by backcountry. The scent of his trail mix and energy bars created an invisible beacon that drew Scarface directly to his campsite. Around 2 a.m., Jake was awakened by sounds of something large moving through his campsite. Through thin nylon walls, he could see the massive silhouette of the bear investigating his gear. The attack was swift and brutal. Scarface's massive paw tore through the tent wall, his claws raking across Jake's chest as he tried to escape. The bear grabbed Jake by the shoulder, his powerful jaws clamping down with bone-crushing force. Jake's screams echoed through the wilderness as the bear dragged him from the tent, shaking him violently. Jake managed to deploy a burst of bear spray, but wind carried most of it away from the advancing predator. The bear knocked him to the ground and began mauling him systematically, focusing on his torso and neck. After what seemed like an eternity, Jake's struggles grew weaker and finally stopped altogether. Scarface began dragging Jake's lifeless body toward a dense thicket where he could feed undisturbed, showing a methodical feeding pattern typical of predatory attack rather than defensive behavior. 2 days later, on June 17th, married couple Tom and Lisa Chen from California set up their campsite 3 miles away from Jake's location. Despite increased ranger presence following Jake's disappearance, they had chosen this remote backcountry site for their anniversary camping trip. Tom, 38, was an experienced hiker who had properly stored their food in bear-proof containers. Lisa, 35, was more cautious about wildlife, but trusted her husband's wilderness experience. They had been camping for years without incident, but Scarface had now fully transitioned into hunting humans as a food source. Despite their proper food storage, Lisa had been wearing clothes that smelled of cooking from their dinner preparation. As she slept, a bear approached their tent, drawn by lingering food odors. The attack on Lisa was even more vicious than Jake's. Scarface showed no signs of being startled. This was calculated predation. He tore through their tent and grabbed Lisa before she could fully wake up. Tom's desperate attempts to drive the bear away with rocks and shouting only delayed the inevitable. Lisa's screams cut through the night air as the bear's massive jaws clamped down on her neck. Tom watched helplessly as his wife was dragged into darkness, her cries growing weaker until they stopped entirely. When he tried to follow, Scarface charged him. knocking him unconscious with a powerful swipe. Tom survived with severe injuries and was found by search teams the next morning. Lisa's partially consumed remains were recovered from the same thicket where Jake's body had been cached. Park officials closed the entire area and successfully tracked Scarface using GPS collar data from a previous capture. The bear was euthanized after wildlife biologists determined he had become too dangerous to relocate, having completely lost his natural fear of humans and developing a pattern of actively hunting people as prey. But while the mountains of Wyoming had claimed their victims through calculated predation, thousands of miles away in the steamy mangrove forest of Bangladesh, another apex predator was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most efficient killers are those that turn a familiar territory into a hunting ground. The humid morning of March 8, 2015 hung heavy over Sundarban's mangrove forest in Bangladesh, where the air itself seemed to pulse with moisture and calls of exotic birds echoed through the dense canopy. Mist rose from the dark waters of countless channels that snaked through this vast wilderness, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that had remained unchanged for centuries. For local fisherman Rashid Hassan, 42, this was just another day of working waters that had sustained his family for generations. Rashid was known throughout his village as a skilled and fearless fisherman who ventured deeper into mangrove maze than most others dared, always returning with the best catches from the most remote fishing grounds. Rashid's weathered face and steady hands spoke of decades spent navigating these treacherous waters. His knowledge of tides, currents, and seasonal fish movements was legendary among local fishermen. Cyclone damage and shifting channels had altered the traditional fishing grounds, pushing fishermen like Rashid into areas they had previously avoided, deeper into the domain of the Sundarban's most feared predator. What Rashid didn't know was that he was entering the hunting territory of the Widowmaker, a female Bengal tiger who had recently lost her cubs to flooding and territorial disputes. Bengal tigers are among the most powerful predators on Earth, capable of taking down prey 3 times their own weight with a single bite. Unlike most big cats, Bengal tigers are exceptional swimmers and have been known to hunt in water, making the mangrove channels of the Sundarban's perfect hunting grounds for these apex predators. Rashid had launched his small wooden boat before dawn, as was his custom, navigating by memory through a maze of waterways toward a promising fishing spot he had discovered the previous week. The area was rich with fish, but it was also isolated. As he worked his nets in the early morning light, Rashid noticed an unusual silence in the forest around him. The normal chorus of birds and monkeys had fallen quiet, replaced by eerie stillness. The Widowmaker had been watching him for over an hour, studying his movements and waiting for the perfect opportunity. Tigers are ambush predators that rely on stealth and surprise, often stalking their prey for hours before striking. Around 10 a.m., as Rashid was hauling in a net full of fish, the attack came without warning. The tigress exploded from the mangrove roots in a powerful leap that carried her nearly 20 feet through the air. She landed directly on Rashid, her massive weight capsizing the small fishing boat instantly. Water erupted in chaos as Rashid was thrown into the murky channel. The tigress had him by the throat, her powerful jaws clamping down with crushing force as she attempted to drag him towards shore. Rashid's struggles grew weaker as the tiger's bite compressed his windpipe and major blood vessels. The murky water around them turned red as the tigress's claws raked across his chest and arms. After what seemed like an eternity, Rashid's body went limp. The tigress, sensing that her prey was no longer struggling, began the process of dragging him toward the mangrove shore where she could feed in safety. Rashid's body disappeared into the dense vegetation, becoming the first victim in what would become a systematic hunting pattern. The final attack occurred on May 8th when fisherman Muhammad Hassan, 52, encountered the tigress while checking his nets at dawn. By this time, the Widowmaker had become completely comfortable hunting humans in her territory, showing no fear of boats or human activity. Muhammad had been warned about the previous attacks, but needed to support his large family. He had been fishing these waters for over 20 years and felt confident in his ability to spot danger. But the tigress had learned to use murky water and dense vegetation to approach completely undetected. The attack was swift and efficient. Muhammad's screams echoed across the empty waterway before being cut short by the tiger's crushing bite. His body was dragged into the mangroves and partially consumed, following the same pattern that had made this tigress one of the most dangerous man-eaters in Sundabaran's history. Wildlife officials eventually tracked the Widowmaker using camera traps and successfully relocated her to a different reserve section. However, she was later found dead from territorial fights with resident tigers, unable to establish herself in an area already occupied by other predators. 2 deaths in the Sundabarans became a cautionary tale throughout the fishing communities of Bangladesh, demonstrating how displaced predators could systematically hunt humans when driven from their natural territory. But their story was far from unique in the annals of human-predator conflict. Thousands of miles away in the sun-soaked waters of the Florida Everglades, another apex predator was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous animals are those that have learned to associate humans not with fear, but with easy meals. The scorching afternoon of September 3, 2016 brought oppressive heat to Everglades National Park, Florida, where the sun beat down mercilessly on dark waters and created shimmering mirages above sawgrass prairies. For Miami tourist David Rodriguez, 45, the sweltering day represented his first visit to the famous Everglades. David, a construction foreman from New Jersey, had come to Florida for a business conference and decided to extend his trip to experience the legendary fishing he had heard so much about. David was an experienced freshwater angler who had fished lakes and rivers throughout the Northeast, but the Everglades represented something entirely different. Vast wilderness where prehistoric predators still ruled waterways. He had rented a small aluminum boat and launched at a popular boat ramp that locals had recommended for its easy access and good fishing. What David didn't realize was that this particular boat launch had become the territory of Big Jake, a massive 12-foot American alligator who had been illegally fed by tourists for several years. Recent drought conditions had concentrated both alligators and humans in the same limited areas, creating a dangerous situation that wildlife officials were only beginning to understand. American alligators are living dinosaurs, virtually unchanged for over 200 million years of evolution. When an alligator becomes habituated to human feeding, it loses its natural fear and begins to associate people with food, transforming these ancient predators into efficient killing machines that actively hunt humans. David had launched his boat around 2 p.m. and spent several hours fishing in deeper channels away from the boat ramp. As evening approached, he returned to the launch area to load his boat back onto the trailer. As David backed his trailer into the water at the boat launch, Big Jake was already watching from nearby. The massive alligator had learned to associate the sounds of boat trailers and engines with the arrival of people who might provide food. David was focused on maneuvering his boat onto the trailer when Big Jake made his move. The attack came at dusk, prime alligator feeding time. As David stood in knee-deep water guiding his boat, the massive reptile exploded from the murky water with shocking speed, his jaws clamping down on David's leg with bone-crushing force. David's screams echoed across the empty boat launch as the alligator began its signature death roll. the spinning motion designed to disorient prey and tear flesh from bone. David's body was whipped through the water like a rag doll, each rotation sending sprays of blood across the concrete ramp. The sound of crushing bone was audible even over David's agonized cries as Big Jake's massive jaws compressed his leg below the knee. David desperately grabbed onto the boat trailer, trying to pull himself out of the water, but the 450-pound alligator's strength was overwhelming. After what seemed like an eternity, Big Jake released David's mangled leg and repositioned for a better grip, clamping his jaws around David's torso. This was the behavior of habituated animals that had learned humans meant food, not something to be avoided. David's struggles grew weaker as massive blood loss and shock took their toll. The alligator dragged him into deeper water, away from the boat ramp where he could feed undisturbed. David Rodriguez died from massive blood loss and trauma, becoming Big Jake's first human victim at a boat launch that had become his hunting ground. 3 weeks later, on September 24th, local fisherman Carlos Mendez, 38, launched his boat at the same ramp during early morning hours. Carlos was a Miami native who had been fishing the Everglades for over 20 years, but he was unaware of David's death. Authorities had not yet connected the attack to a specific location or alligator. Carlos was an experienced angler who understood the dangers of alligator country, but like many locals, he had become complacent. He had launched from this ramp dozens of times without incident, and the early morning timing should have been safer than David's evening encounter. But Big Jake had now fully associated the boat launch with feeding opportunities. The massive alligator had been patrolling the area regularly, and he recognized the sounds of boat trailers and engines as signals that food might be available. As Carlos backed his trailer into the water, Big Jake approached from a deeper channel. The attack followed the same pattern as David's killing: surprise assault from murky water, targeting the victim who was focused on launching his boat rather than watching for predators. Carlos managed to scream once before Big Jake's jaws clamped down on his arm, but the remote location meant no one heard his cries for help. The alligator's death roll broke Carlos's arm in multiple places before the massive reptile repositioned for a killing bite to the torso. Carlos's body was dragged into deeper water and partially consumed, following the same feeding pattern that had characterized David's death. His truck and empty trailer were found at the boat launch the next day, leading to a search that eventually recovered his remains from the same area where Big Jake had cached David's body. Unlike typical alligator behavior of retreating after an attack, Big Jake remained in the area, actually approaching rescue boats that arrived to search for the bodies. This behavior confirmed to wildlife officials that they were dealing with a completely habituated animal that had lost all natural fear of humans. Wildlife officials used baited traps to capture the 12-foot, 450-pound alligator 3 days after Carlos's death. Big Jake showed no fear of the trappers and actually approached their boat, seeking food. The massive alligator was euthanized due to his dangerous behavior and size, with necropsy results confirming human remains in his stomach from all 3 attacks. The boat launch was permanently closed to the public, and new warning signs were installed throughout the area. The tragedy served as a stark reminder that feeding wild alligators creates killers, transforming ancient predators into efficient human hunters through misguided human interaction. But while Florida's prehistoric predators had claimed their victims through learned behavior and conditioning, deep in the forest of Uganda, another type of killer was about to emerge, one whose intelligence and emotional complexity would make its capacity for violence all the more terrifying when territorial instincts overrode years of peaceful coexistence. The humid morning air of April 12, 2017 brought the familiar sounds of the African forest to Kibale National Park, Uganda, where the canopy echoed with calls of countless bird species and distant hoots of chimpanzees greeting dawn. Mist clung to towering mahogany trees, creating an ethereal atmosphere that had captivated researchers and visitors for decades. For Dr. Sarah Mitchell, 34, this was another day of groundbreaking research into chimpanzee social behavior. The British primatologists have been studying the same troop for 3 years, documenting their complex social interactions and territorial behaviors for her upcoming book on great ape intelligence. She was known in academic circles for her fearless approach to field research, often spending weeks at a time living in close proximity to chimpanzee troops she studied. Her weathered field clothes and confident demeanor spoke of countless hours spent in the African wilderness, earning the respect of both her subjects and colleagues. Working alongside her was James Akello, 28, a local Ugandan guide whose knowledge of the forest and its inhabitants was legendary among the research community. James had been working with international researchers for over 8 years, serving as both translator and cultural bridge between the scientific community and local villages that bordered the park. What neither Sarah nor James fully understood was that recent agricultural expansion had compressed the chimpanzee territories, creating an unprecedented stress among troops they studied. The alpha male of the group they were researching, a 20-year-old chimpanzee named Brutus, was showing increasingly aggressive behavior as his territory overlapped more frequently with human activity. Chimpanzees share 98.8% of their DNA with humans, making them our closest living relatives. But this genetic similarity includes a capacity for violence that can be truly shocking. Adult male chimps possess strength 5 times greater than humans, with canine teeth designed for tearing flesh and hands capable of literally ripping limbs from bodies. When territorial stress combines with their excellent memory and capacity for holding grudges, chimpanzees can become calculated and methodical killers. Sarah and James have been tracking Brutus's troop since dawn, following them to a feeding area near the research station where the chimps often foraged for fruit. The location was familiar territory for both researchers and chimpanzees, a place where 3 years of peaceful coexistence had created a false sense of security. As the morning progressed, Sarah noticed that Brutus seemed more agitated than usual. The massive alpha male, weighing over 120 pounds and standing nearly 4 feet tall, was displaying aggressive postures toward other members of his troop, behavior that often preceded territorial conflicts with neighboring groups. What Sarah didn't realize was that Brutus had begun to associate the research team with territorial pressure his troop was experiencing. Recent encounters with agricultural workers clearing forest land had heightened his stress levels, and his primitive brain was making connections between human presence and threats to his domain. Around 11 a.m., as Sarah was documenting feeding behaviors, she accidentally stepped between Brutus and the fruit tree he was approaching. In chimpanzee social dynamics, this was a direct challenge to his authority, a mistake that would have deadly consequences. The attack was swift and brutal. Brutus charged Sarah with shocking speed, his powerful arms swinging in wide arcs designed to inflict maximum damage. His first blow caught Sarah across the chest, the impact lifting her off her feet and sending her crashing into a nearby tree. James immediately began shouting and throwing rocks at Brutus, trying to drive the enraged chimpanzee away from Sarah. But Brutus's attack was methodical and calculated, not the random aggression of a startled animal. He grabbed Sarah by the arm and began dragging her deeper into the forest, away from any potential help. Sarah's screams echoed through the canopy as Brutus's powerful jaws clamped down on her shoulder, his canine teeth penetrating deep into muscle and bone. James continued his desperate attempts to rescue Sarah, but the chimpanzee's strength was overwhelming, and his territorial rage made him immune to intimidation. After what seemed like an eternity, Sarah's struggles grew weaker as blood loss and shock took their toll. Brutus, sensing that his victim was no longer a threat, began the systematic mauling that would characterize all his subsequent attacks on humans. James managed to escape and radio for help, but by the time the rescue team arrived, Sarah was dead. Her body showed the methodical violence typical of chimpanzee attacks. Focused damage to the face, hands, and genitals, areas that chimps instinctively target to disable threats and assert dominance. The final attack occurred on June 8th, when Dr. Michael Chen, 38, a visiting researcher from the University of California, encountered Brutus while conducting solo observations near a research station. Michael had been warned about the previous attacks, but believed his years of experience with great apes would protect him. Michael was an expert in chimpanzee behavior who had worked with troops in Tanzania and the Democratic Republic of Congo without serious incident. His confidence in his ability to read chimpanzee body language and avoid confrontation proved fatally misplaced when dealing with a territorial alpha male who had already killed 2 humans. Brutus approached Michael with the calculated patience of a predator who had learned that humans were vulnerable prey. The chimpanzee showed none of the warning displays typical of defensive aggression. This was behavior of an animal that had crossed the line from territorial defense to active predation. The attack was swift and efficient. Brutus grabbed Michael before the researcher could react, driving him away from the research station where his screams might attract help. The methodical violence that followed confirmed that Brutus had become one of the most dangerous animals ever documented in Uganda's national parks. The research project was immediately suspended and relocated after wildlife authorities determined that Brutus had become too dangerous due to territorial stress and previous negative human interactions. The alpha male's behavior had fundamentally changed, from defensive aggression to active hunting of humans within his territory. Brutus was eventually tracked and euthanized by park rangers, but his 3-month killing spree had forever changed how researchers approached great ape studies in compressed habitats. Yet, as terrifying as the encounters with our closest evolutionary relatives can be, perhaps the most primal fear lies in the depths of the ocean, where ancient predators patrol waters that have remained unchanged for millions of years, turning paradise destinations into hunting grounds for creatures that embody the very essence of evolutionary perfection. The crisp morning of October 15, 2013 brought perfect conditions to Gansbaai, South Africa, where the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon under a brilliant blue sky. The water was unusually clear for this time of year, with visibility extending several meters below the surface. For spearfisherman Peter Jackson, 29, this was a perfect opportunity to dive near Seal Island during peak seal pupping season. Peter was an experienced diver who had been spearfishing in South African waters for over a decade, drawn by the abundant marine life and crystal clear visibility that made underwater hunting both challenging and rewarding. What Peter didn't know was that these waters had become the hunting ground of the Interceptor, a massive 16-foot female great white shark whose behavior had been altered by years of cage diving operations. Constant boat traffic and artificial feeding associated with shark tourism had made this apex predator less fearful of human activity and more aggressive around boats. Great white sharks are evolutionary perfection, virtually unchanged for over 400 million years. Their 300 serrated teeth, arranged in multiple rows that continuously regenerate, can slice through flesh and bone with surgical precision. When a great white loses its natural fear of humans, it becomes a calculating killer that can mistake people for its natural prey. Peter had successfully speared a large yellow-tailed tuna and was swimming back toward his boat when the blood trail from his catch attracted the interceptor's attention. The massive shark had been patrolling the same hunting grounds, and the scent of blood triggered her predatory response. Great whites typically investigate potential prey through what marine biologists call a test bite, a single exploratory attack to determine if the target is suitable food. But the interceptor's conditioning from cage diving operations had altered this natural behavior, making her more aggressive and less likely to release unsuitable prey. The attack came at dawn, prime hunting time when sharks patrol close to shore and visibility is reduced. Peter never saw the interceptor approaching from the depths below. The massive shark struck with such force that she launched herself partially out of the water, her jaws clamping around Peter's legs. Peter's screams echoed across the water as the interceptor began their characteristic thrashing motion, designed to tear flesh from bone and incapacitate prey. The speared fish he had been carrying only intensified the shark's feeding response, as the blood in the water confirmed that this was a legitimate food source. Despite Peter's desperate attempts to fight back, striking the shark's snout and gills with his spear gun, the interceptor's size and strength were overwhelming. The massive predator dragged him beneath the surface, where his struggles grew weaker as blood loss and shock took their toll. Peter's boat was found drifting empty later that day, with his spear gun floating nearby and a large blood slick marking the attack site. His body was never recovered, though marine biologists noted that the interceptor had been seen in the area with what appeared to be human remains in her jaws. The final attack occurred on December 8th during a cage diving expedition when tourist Michael Santos, 42, from Australia, experienced equipment failure that left him exposed outside the protective cage. Michael had paid for the ultimate shark encounter experience, but the interceptor's altered behavior patterns made even professional operations dangerous. As Michael descended in the protective cage, the interceptor approached with the aggressive curiosity that had been conditioned by years of cage diving operations. The massive shark had learned that cages meant food rewards, and she began investigating the structure with increasing intensity. The cage's protective bars, designed to keep sharks out, became a trap when the interceptor's massive head became wedged between them during an aggressive investigation. Her thrashing to free herself caused structural damage to the cage, bending the bars and creating a gap large enough for her massive body to enter. Michael found himself trapped in a confined space with a 16-foot great white shark in full predatory mode. The interceptor's attack was swift and methodical, her massive jaws clamping down on Michael's torso with such crushing force that it fractured ribs and punctured vital organs. By the time the crew managed to separate the shark from the cage using bang sticks and boat engines, Michael had suffered massive trauma and blood loss. He was pronounced dead upon reaching the surface, his body showing the characteristic wounds of a great white shark attack. Marine biologists who investigated the incident noted that the interceptor showed less fear of boats and human activity than typical great whites, likely due to conditioning from frequent cage diving operations. The shark was eventually tagged and tracked, showing that she remained in the area for several more months before moving to different hunting grounds. The 3 deaths around Seal Island led to enhanced safety protocols for cage diving operations and additional research into how shark tourism affects predator behavior. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.